Today's stuff we're going to be learning is Bava Batra Daf Kuf Nun Hey. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to start with a little bit of review of the end of yesterday's stuff, which was a little confusing because we unraveled everything we did earlier. So let's just do a quick review. We have two approaches to how to understand the machloket in our Mishnah about a document of a person. We don't know if they were shchimera, we don't know if they were bari, we don't know if they were sick or healthy. When they wrote it, they forgot to put in those details or for whatever reason, even though normally those details are in. And then we have a deliberation. The person says, I want my gift back. Okay, someone asked a question yesterday, so maybe I'll respond to this in class, which is why does it sometimes appear that the person is trying to get the gift back, and sometimes it appears that the person is trying to get the gift, the other side. So from what I understand, most of these situations, the gift hasn't been given yet. The gift is actually in the possession of the giver because the gift was really kind of in the event that I die. And then the person gets better, and now the recipient is claiming, I have a document that says you're giving me this gift, and they want to take it, right? So again, I think the default is that the giver still has the gift. It hasn't been given yet because really the intent was to give after death. The issue comes up if they get better, and then they claim, well, it was a shchimera gift. I wasn't planning to give this to you I was only planning to give it to you when I died, and I didn't die, so I want it back. And the other person's claiming, what do you mean? It's a gift. You gave it to me as a gift. And that's the deliberation. So I would assume that the vast majority of these cases are where the gift hasn't been given yet because it really was intended as a shchimera. Now, in our Mishnah, we're not sure if it was or not. So that's a different deliberation. And it could be it was in their hand already because we have this document that doesn't say either which way. But a classic shchimera gift was only meant to be given upon death. And therefore, usually it just wasn't given yet. And if anyone is trying to claim rights to it, it's the recipient. So now we have this debate. Who needs to bring the proof? Where do we assume? Right? Do we assume Chezkat Marikama, the original owner, the giver? Or do we assume Chezkat of Hashta? The person's sick now, we assume the person was sick at the time. If the person was well now, we assume the person was well at the time. What kind of proof needs to be brought? So the first obvious answer was Raya Be'edim. What witnesses who could come say the person was sick at the time or the person was well at the time? And depending on who has to prove, they would have to prove their side. But then we had this other approach, which was in the last discussion of it. It was Rabbi Yochanan and Reish Lakish. Rabbi Yochanan held by the first. Reish Lakish said, no, it's a machloket b'kiyum shtar, meaning what would be the proof according to the rabbis, where the recipients would have to prove? They would have to do what's called kiyum shtar. They would just need to prove that the shtar is valid, and that would enable them to demand the money. Why? Because they have a plain document that doesn't say anything in particular. And the main thing it says is this person gave me a gift. So if they could prove that the shtar is valid, they can get the money. Because in the end, what do they have? A shtar matana that says. And if you remember, what's this modeh shtar shekatvo? So, okay, so now we have this debate. If the person agrees that the shtar is a shtar, I wrote the shtar, I said I was giving you the gift, but, right, and they qualify it. Some people say we ignore the but. That's the first side. That's Rabbi Meir. Rabbi Meir says, we ignore that. The document stands on its own. And on that basis, they can collect it. According to the rabbis, that document doesn't stand on its own because the person who admitted they wrote it without kiyum shtar, without ratifying this document, and just because the person admitted they wrote it, since the person who admitted they wrote it also undermined its validity and said, but it's not valid anymore, well, we believe that. And therefore, there needs to be proof of what? The rabbis require proof that the shtar is a valid shtar. And that's enough. As soon as they prove it's valid, they can demand the money from the giver. So what was the problem? Well, the problem was that Reish Lakish came and asked Rabbi Yochanan the following question. So just to remember, Rabbi Meir says, no, you don't need for kiyum shtar. We ignore what the person claimed, the disclaimer. We ignore it. We take the shtar as is. No need for kiyum shtar. So Reish Lakish brought this source of Bar Kapara, where it seemed to imply, without going into the details, that there's no need for kiyum shtar. To which he says, that seems like Rabbi Meir and not the rabbis. And why would it be that Bar Kapara would bring something that's an individual's opinion? To which Rabbi Yochanan answered, it's everyone's opinion. They don't argue about that. Which at the time seemed okay, but then the Gemara starts asking all these questions. How could you say they don't argue? We saw a Breita where they argue. Okay, we resolved the Breita was about witnesses, not the Baldin. We could differentiate. But then they said Rabbi Yochanan himself said that, if you remember, Rabbi Yanai said, Modeh b'shtar shekatvo tzarich l'kaimo, and Rabbi Yochanan said, that's the machloket in our Mishnah, which raises all sorts of problems. What do you mean that's the machloket in the Mishnah? Rabbi Yochanan was the one who said the machloket is about raya be'edim and not kiyum shtar. And that's like the last question they asked, but it was really the first question to be asked, which is that's not what Rabbi Yochanan holds. And then we had the problem because according to that, the rabbis say, right, that hamotzim chaver alav haraya ein raya ela b'kiyum shtar, you need kiyum shtar, and that in of itself goes against what there. He says Rabbi Meir and the rabbis disagree. What was his answer to Reish Lakish before? Don't think this is just Rabbi Meir. Everyone agrees, but he says everyone doesn't agree about this issue. To which the Gemara switched Rabbi Meir and the rabbis and said, when he said everyone agrees, he means all the rabbis against Rabbi Meir. And then you'd have to switch who says what, because the opinion that Reish Lakish was discussing was the one we attributed to Rabbi Meir. And the rabbis are saying that's actually, and Rabbi Yochanan saying, no, that's the rabbi's opinion. And then we have to switch that. And then we have to switch the Breita as well, because their opinions lined up with the opinions in the Breita about the witnesses who tried to undermine a shtar. And then we had to say, and Rabbi Yochanan and Reish Lakish switched positions. And that's where we ended yesterday. So now the Gemara asks, okay, well, if we're switching everything, then there's another thing that we should switch. Now we have to remember all the different parts that happened here. After we had the opinions of Rabbi Yochanan and Reish Lakish, Rabbi Yochanan brought a difficulty from the story in Bnei Brak, okay, which we'll review now because that story is going to come up a few times today. There was a story in Bnei Brak, it was at the bottom of Kuf Nun Dalet, about somebody who sold his father's property that he inherited. The family came and said he wasn't old enough to sell, and we're going to get to today what age, all that. We're going to get into all those details. But right now, we'll just say he wasn't old enough to sell. Let's say he wasn't 20 yet. And that's what they claimed. And now, Rabbi Yochanan claimed at first that where was the money still? It never had been given to the people he sold it to. And therefore, what happened? Well, the people he sold it to wanted to get the money. They said, let's check the body and see. We'll prove he was a gadol. And then we said, right. And then Rabbi Akiva said, oh, we can't do that. Okay. But that's not the important part. Comes Rabbi Yochanan at the top of Kuf Nun Dalet Amud Bet and said, this works to me that the proof was Eidim, because look what they're trying to prove. The Lekuchot to get the money are trying to prove, was he old or was he not, right? Was he old enough? But what are they not trying to do? If really Reish Lakish was right, the machloket's kiyum shtar, and the rabbis say, all you have to do is makayim the shtar and you'll be able to get your money. Likewise here, they could have just done kiyum shtar, which would have been a lot easier than going into the grave and checking for hair growth. So that was his question. Reish Lakish said, oh, you didn't understand the case. The case was not that the lekuchot were trying to get it, the purchasers. The case was that the family were the ones who were trying to get it out of the hands of the purchasers. The purchasers already had it. And the family was trying to say this wasn't a valid sale. Now, kiyum shtar wouldn't help them. Kiyum shtar only goes against them. And that's why kiyum shtar just wasn't relevant. That was the first way we read it. So Gemara is suggesting now is, if Rabbi Yochanan and Reish Lakish switch positions, it should also just switch who raised the question against who and who answered the question. So do we have to switch that as well? To which the Gemara says, no, we don't have to. Hachi ka'amrle Rabbi Yochanan the Rabbi Shimon ben Lakish. We can explain it in the following way. The Rabbi Yochanan did raise a question, but in a different way. And here we're going to start with a different assumption. Not that Rabbi Yochanan thought it hadn't yet been passed to the purchasers. No, the purchasers already had it in hand, and the family is trying to get it back. And here he says the following. Bishlama ledidi da'amina raya b'kiyum shtar. Hainu demishkachale denachte lekucha lenechasim. If we're assuming the lekuchot already got the possessions, how did they get the possessions if not that it's all about raya b'kiyum shtar? And, okay, now, meaning, what do the rabbis say? The rabbis say, okay, let's go back to our opinion according to the switched opinions. The rabbis are the ones who say, shtar, moed b'shtar shakatvo, ein sarich l'kaimo, which means that the lekuchot had a right to take the property because they had a document supporting it. And you don't need kiyum shtar in this case because the other side agreed it was written. They just thought it was done by someone who was a minor. But the document was actually written and the document's valid. And that allowed them to, before the story came up, for them to have collected their property. But now let's see why this is a problem with Reish Lakish. You said the machloket's raya be'edim. And Moed B'Shar Shekatvo, everyone would agree you have to be Mekayim the shtar. You need Kiyum shtarot. And there was no Kiyum shtar here. So how on earth did the Lekuchot even have a way to get the property into their hands? They have no valid document yet. The document wasn't ratified. So, and almost saying like this, if the family comes to complain, let's say they did get it somehow, they can easily get it back until the document's validated. And that's not what they're talking about in this story. To which Reish Lakish says, no. And Reish Lakish makes a huge differentiation between this case and our case. And it's a very obvious one if you think about it. Comes Reish Lakish and says, again, this is the new reading of that Reish Lakish could have said this. We don't really know what happened. We're just trying to come up with a way that Rabbi Yochanan could use that as a difficulty against Reish Lakish, and Reish Lakish could come up with an answer according to this new reading, that their opinions are switched. If the family had come and said, this document's not good, how can you even take this? Okay, because right, you need Kiyum shtar. Well, that wouldn't work. Because my kamra, in other words, even according to me, that you would, let's say, need Kiyum shtar, and you would need to have Raya Be'edim, that you would need to prove he was a gadol at the time. No, you wouldn't actually. Why not? My kamre, katan haya. The family is claiming the document's no good. Why? Because he was a minor. Well, chazaka ein aidim chotmim al shtar elam ken naseh gadol. We have chazaka working in the favor of the purchasers in this case. And that's why it could be that the purchasers managed to get the money, and then the family came and complained and said, but he's a minor, but they still have valid claim to the money before, right? And then it's the family that had to, remember, it's the family in the end that had to go prove that the child was a katan. So Reish Lakish says, on what basis? Now, in our case, it wouldn't be enough basis. In our case, you'd have to prove, was the person a shlimera, was the person a bari, depending on who, what, and, the opinions. But in this case, there's a chazaka working in favor of the shtar, because the shtar is a deed of purchase. Could the lekuchot have purchased? Well, if there's edim on the shtar, what do we assume? We have an assumption that edim don't sign unless the child was of age. In other words, if you're going to sign on a document, okay, let's start with an example of a lawyer. You go to a lawyer to sign a document for you. Most lawyers, if they're careful lawyers, they're going to very carefully read that document and make sure everything is accurate before they sign their name. Because if you sign your name on a document that's not a valid document, it's your reputation on the line. And even if you're not, let's say, going to lose your license as a lawyer to practice, if you're found to have done this, even if you're a regular person, you have a reputation in the community. If people see that you signed on this document without checking the details and without checking that the child was actually of age, that's your fault and you're going to look bad. So therefore, there's a general assumption, even if we wouldn't say in every document, we're going to say it doesn't need Kiyum shtar. The default is we can assume it was Mekuyam as long as, remember, the other side admits that they wrote it, so that already gives it validity, just says, but there's a problem, we ignore the but, or maybe we don't ignore the but, right? In that case, there's a machloket, and some say we don't ignore the but, but in this story, for sure, we're going to go side with the shtar, because the shtar would not have been written and signed if it weren't for the fact that the child must have been a gadol already, he must have been of age, and therefore, this case, you could explain that the lekuchot had it, even though in our case now, we're going to explain it like this. If there was a problem here and the child was a katan and the edim signed, that would be a problematic shtar. Our shtar, either the person was bari or they were shlimera. Either way, it's a valid document. It just might mean that it's been undone because the person got better now and they were sick at the time and thought they were going to die. But either which way, whether it was a shlimera, whether it was a bari, and it just forgot to put those details in, it wouldn't be a bad shtar. It wouldn't be ruined. No one's reputation would be on the line if it turned out that the person was healthy when they wrote it, or turned out they were not healthy when they wrote it, right? That's not a factor here where this chazaka would come into play, that the edim don't sign unless they know the facts are correct. It's facts either which way. It's not like incorrect facts. So the two cases are totally different, and therefore don't question me from that case, because that's not the same as ours. That's Reish Lakish. That would be what Reish Lakish would answer back. If we read the difficulty of Rabbi Yochanan as we read it, Reish Lakish could have an answer. So that was the only one part of the sugya that we didn't have to reverse everything. Because it's always better if you don't have to reverse things, right? If it came down to us that Rabbi Yochanan used this source as difficulty on Reish Lakish, better to just change how he used the source rather than change that he used the source, and right, as opposed to saying, oh, the names are switched. So whereas just before they were very flippant in saying, oh, this switches with that, this switches with that, there's a limit. Where they can fit it in, they'd rather fit it in and come up with this explanation. Okay, now we're done with that really, although we're going off now on a tangent from this, which is Itmar, there was a machloket about at what age is a minor allowed to sell property the minor inherits? Now let's just talk about the concept here. Child inherits property from the father. The child is a minor. Okay, we don't know what kind of minor. We'll get to that soon. But the child, we're worried that the child won't understand the value of what the child inherited. By the way, the Rashbam says this is specifically in a case where they inherit property from their father. This isn't any child who wants to sell property. What's the difference? So the Nimukei Yosef explains very interestingly the logic behind this. If a child didn't earn the money and got it through inheritance, they might not understand its value as much. And they might be very flippant to sell it. Someone will offer them some money. They'll say, oh, that sounds great. And they'll sell it. Right? Some people say also kids particularly are very excited by money. I think that comes up in the beginning of the sugya tomorrow, about how kids, love getting money, like wave money in front of kids. And they'll be, wow, I want money. They won't understand how much money it is. Right? Like that Shel Silverstein smart about the kid who's so smart, he trades his dollar for 2 quarters and then 2 quarters for 4 dimes and 4 dimes for 5 nickels and then for 5 pennies, thinking, wow, look at all the money I got. So that's a great example of a child who doesn't understand the value. So someone will wave money in their face and they'll say, oh, great, I'll sell my property for money. That's really our big concern here. So, but it's more, the Nimukei Yosef points out, it's more when it's not something that they earned or purchased on their own. It's something they inherited where they don't understand it properly. Now, it's true. You have to wonder, doesn't the minor have an apotropos? It's a good question. Where that comes in here, I assume this is where the child's working without an apotropos. Okay? Why they would be doing that, it's a good question. Now, also, to what age the apotropos worked for the child? We're talking now, you're going to see in a minute, 18 or 20. So it's a good question where the apotropos fits in. I don't have a good answer for that question. I do think it's a valid question. And I assume we're talking here with the child selling it without an apotropos. So now, when can a child sell nichse aviv? Rava Amar Rav Nachman ben 18. Rav Huna bar Chinan Amar Rav Nachman mi ben 20 shana. So deliberation, what Rav Nachman actually said. Was it 18 or was it 20? Okay. Now we're going to skip those next words in parentheses. These words are going to come up 3 times in the sugya. And in 2 out of the 3 places, it's in parentheses and saying this is not the right place for it. Okay, so I'm just going to ignore it right now. We'll get to it when we get to it. Mativ Rabbi Zeira. So comes Rabbi Zeira, and he has a difficulty on one of the opinions here. It's going to be on the one that says 20. Why? From Maaseh Bnei Brak. So right now we're going to reread the case. Maaseh Bnei Brak be'echad shemachar b'nechsei aviv v'met. Right, where a child sold his father's possessions that he inherited, and then the child died. Ba'u b'nei mishpacha v'iraru, and then the family came and said, he was a minor. He shouldn't have sold it. And remember, according to the way we understand it now, it's in the purchaser's hands, and the family is trying to get it from the purchasers. Rabbi Akiva, and they said to Rabbi Akiva, we check and show the child was a katan at the time, right? Because now he's still a katan. He doesn't have 2 pubic hairs, and he's sign of physical maturity, and therefore it seems, it's a problem. Now, we don't yet know why this is going to prove. Don't worry, you're not supposed to understand this yet, how this is going to work as a proof for one side or the other. Again, we're deliberating between 18 and 20. So hold off. Because there's a Mishna in Nidda that you don't know yet, which is going to play an important role here. Right now, we're just reading the case to refresh our memory, and because the Gemara brought it. Amar lahem, this part really isn't so important anymore, but Rabbi Akiva says to them, you can't do that, you can't open the grave. And even if you could, simanim asuim lishtanot lachar mita. Okay, those simanim might change, and you won't be able to prove it anyway, even if you could open the grave. So now, what does this have to do with anything? This makes sense if you say 18 is the age. Why? And again, we won't really understand this for another minute or 2, so hold off. Turning now to Amud Bet. So now they're assuming the child must have been, okay, again, you don't understand this all yet. You won't we won't fully understand, but they're going to assume the child was somewhere over 18, and that's why there was a question. Under 18, there wouldn't even be a question. Over 18, but under 20. Okay, that would have to be the range of how old this child was. And that's why they wanted to check. Because I'll already preface this by saying it's not just 18. You have to be 18 and have two pubic hair, signs of physical maturity. If you don't have signs of physical maturity and you're 18, you can't sell it. Okay, just like when there's issues relating to bar bat mitzvah, you have to be bar bat mitzvah and also have shnei simanim. Without simanim, you're still considered a minor. So it's 18 with shnei simanim. And that's why it makes perfect sense. The child was, let's say, 18 and a half, and they wanted to prove there were no signs of physical maturity, and therefore the sale wasn't valid. Okay, you should think the same thing could be if the child was 20 and a half or 21, but we're going to see not. And why is that? If you say the child's already 20, there's no need to check for simanim. Why? What's the difference between 18 and 20? Well, the Mishna Nidda says there's a difference. Okay, in other words, what we're going to say is until age 20, you need two things. You need to be either, right? Again, this is the way we're going to read the story. Either 18, you need to be 18 and have signs of physical maturity. So that's what was going on in this story. The child had reached the age, but they hadn't necessarily reached the stage of physical maturity. So that was what they wanted to check. But once the child reaches 20, the Mishnah in Nidda says, "V'hatnan ben esrim shelo hevi shtei sa'arot." If a child is 20 and doesn't yet have two sa'arot, signs of physical maturity, all they have to do is yaviu ra'ayashu ben esrim, prove the child is 20, v'hu saris, and this child is what's called a saris. Then, what's a saris? This is someone who will never reach physical maturity. We normally assume that there's a path that a child takes. At a certain point, there's age and there's physical maturity. We need both of those things to happen. At a certain point, we give up and we say this child is never going to develop signs of physical maturity. It must be some people say it's congenital. We're going to see in the Gemara, they say perhaps there's societal things that affect this. But there's something called a category called a saris. And for a woman, it's an ailonit. We've learned about this before. And those are characters or people who will never reach sign of maturity. Now, at a certain point, now, in this area, we're going to have to treat them as, okay, now here it's going to differ. When it comes to, now the Mishnah Nidda was discussing, lo choletz v'lo miyabim. Now, someone who's a saris is not valid to do yibum or chalitza. So if there's a woman whose husband died without children, and the only brother that's there is this child that hasn't reached a stage of maturity, she waits and waits and waits. Let's not talk about how, we can talk about it. It's a complicated situation. She's just waiting for this child to mature. And she's waiting and waiting and waiting. Child reaches 20, it's a cutoff. They say, okay, at 20, we assume this child's a saris, never going to reach the stage of maturity. Just, I'm warning you because in another minute, we're going to change our understanding of this. So don't get too set in understanding this is the only way. But right now, we're going to explain a child who's 20, doesn't have any signs of physical maturity, is already in a category of a saris, and a saris is exempt from yibum and chalitza. Just like if she's an ailonit, she's also exempt from yibum and chalitza. So if that's the case, what do we see here? At 20, we don't care anymore if you have signs of maturity or not. And for this purpose of a sale, we're going to treat you already as a grown-up. So if the child was already 20, then they wouldn't need to check simanim. It would be obvious the child's sale was a valid sale and there's nothing to discuss. So that's why it seems more likely that the cutoff was 18, but it's 18 with simanim, and 20 already, you don't need simanim, because that fits with the Mishnah Nidda. And then this case must have been the child was between 18 and 20, and that's why they were checking for simanim. Because if the cutoff age is 20, and we have this Mishnah Nidda that says at 20, you don't even need to check for simanim, then the story makes no sense. The child was over 20, there would be no point to check for simanim. That's the proof. So this is where I think it was, who brought it? Mativ Rabbi Zeira. Rabbi Zeira brought this as a difficulty and said, this is a problem because there'd be no way to explain this source if the child was 20. But I did tell you that we were going to change our understanding a little bit of the Mishnah Nidda, which we're going to do right now to resolve the difficulty. Lav Itmarlan, it's not just to resolve the difficulty, but they say it was already said on that Mishnah that it wasn't exactly how I just explained it. Amar Rav Shmuel bar Rav Yitzchak Amar Rav, Behu shenoldu bo simanei saris. There's two tracks for a child over 20. There's a child who's over 20. Okay, now no matter what, this child is over 20, has no simanim of maturity, okay, which means no two pubic hairs. So we have this child, but within that, there's two tracks. One of them is the child also has simanim of a saris, where there's a list of them in Yevamot. I'm not going to go into it now, but there's a list of other physical signs that this child is a saris. It's not just absence of signs of maturity. It's also, there's other signs that went with somebody being a saris, which means they'll never reach a stage of maturity. Whereas there's some children who get to age 20, don't have simanim, signs of physical maturity, but there's still a possibility they might because they don't have any sign otherwise that they're a saris. So if they don't have those other signs, then you would still check for simanim. Now, there's going to have to be a cutoff point at some point. I mentioned this yesterday. So you might remember, you might not, but we'll get to it right now. So now, what are we going to say? Amarava, and Rava's going to say, and daikanami de katane. Well, even further prove that from the language of the Mishnah. Now, I read the language of the Mishnah a little differently, but it says now, vihu hasaris, shmamina. Okay, let's go back and read the Mishnah and see what they're saying. Ben eslim shelo hevi shtei saro yaviu rayashu ben eslim. Right, a 20-year-old who doesn't have two sarot, two hairs, will bring proof that he's 20. Vehu hasaris. Now, I said, and this means he's a saris, but no, they read it as, and he has to bring two proofs. One, that he's 20, and two, that he's a saris, meaning he has signs, physical signs that show that sarisim generally have. And then lo choletz v'lo miyabem. But in the absence of that, we're still going to wait, which means that the story could have been a child who was 20, who didn't have any signs of it being a saris, and therefore we still had to check for sarot. And now the Gemara is going to ask the question that I mentioned yesterday, which is, okay, what if you're 20 and you don't have simanim of a saris? We're going to forever consider you a child? Is there some sort of cutoff? Tani Rabbi Chia ad rov shnotav. Rabbi Chia taught in a braita until the majority of his life, which don't be shocked, and I hope it won't scare you, but half life is 35 years and a day. Okay, we said 36 yesterday, means into the 36th year, because there was an assumption that the general lifespan of a person was 70 years. Okay, we know that, by the way, from the Choni story, if you remember. Also, there was the 70 years. 70 years was considered the lifetime of a person in those days. We've seen it in a whole bunch of sources. And therefore, 35 in a day is already the half point of a person's life. At the half point of a person's life, we give them, okay, you're mature. And then, so we have these two tracks. You could be 20 with simanim of a saris. And if we go with the age of 20, then we're going to say at 20, with signs of a saris, you can already sell your father's property. Obviously, there's 20, right, with shtei sarot. That's a regular person. But if you're on the track of not having any sarot, you could be 20 with signs of a saris, or you'd have to wait till you were 35 in a day. Okay? So that is the end of that section. Now we have, now we just have a side point. This is classic. The Gemara wants to talk about, well, what if you're one of these people? Okay, now, if you think about the chalitza and what a bad situation is for this woman, right? She could wait till the kid's 36, 35 in a day. That would be really awful. But it's a pretty rare situation. You'd have to have, number one, a gibum situation, which is pretty rare in and of itself. And you would have to have, right, because you would have to have been married and not had any children before the husband died. And number two, you would all, if you think about it also, it was more likely the women died in those days because they would die in childbirth often. That was also like more common that a woman would die young than a man, I would think, in those days. But in general, somewhat rare, although, yes, as Becky, you're pointing out, nowadays, unfortunately, with the war, it's very common, which could have been also in those days, you could say. You know, there were wars, there were, you know, usually the younger men fight. But also, you would have to have had only one brother, and that brother was the saris, which was a very rare situation as it is, and not had signs that they were a saris. Okay, either which way, it's a pretty rare case, so wouldn't get so worked up about this woman being an aguna because it's unlikely it would really happen. Now the Gemara is telling you what are ways. Now, nowadays we have all people on hormone therapy to get things going earlier, right? Or if someone's not growing, all sorts of things that we do. So also in those days, they were troubled by these things. How are we going to get this going? So Kiata Lekametu Rabbi Chia, when they came before Rabbi Chia, he gave them some medical advice and said, Ikachish Amale Libre. If they're very thin, could be it's malnutrition that's causing the lack of physical maturity and of physical development. And therefore, tell them, eat a lot of food. I mean, obviously they might not be eating because they didn't have food, but people should try to find them food so that they can eat and gain weight. And hopefully that will bring about the physical maturity. Ibre Amale Likush. If they're overweight, that also could be causing it. So tell them to lose weight. These simanim sometimes come from losing weight and sometimes come from gaining weight, depending on your situation. Basically saying malnutrition or obesity could be a cause for lack of development of physical signs of maturity, and therefore, depending on what situation you're in, do the reverse, and that might help you. That's a total aside, which fits in with other medicinal or health advice that the rabbis gave people. Now we have another question. This is your classic, what age? When we talk about age, then, well, when in that age? What if you're into your 18th year? Okay, you're 17 and a day, or according to the 20, if you're into the 20th year, like 19 and a day, is that considered 19 and a day like 20? And your sale will be a valid sale? Or is it not? So is it kilifnei hazman? Is it like you're still under 18? Or is it like you're already 18? Rava amar Rav Nachman toch zman kilifnei hazman. Rava bar Rav Shila amar Rav Nachman toch zman kilachar zman. Again, a deliberation what Rav Nachman said. One by Rava bar Rav Shila. Is it, right? The first opinion is Rava, who said under 18, you're under 18. Doesn't matter if you're 17 in a day into your 18th year. No, you're under 18. And the second opinion is, no, you're considered 18. But now they're telling us, and this was the line that was in parentheses once before and will be in parentheses later on, which is, Rava said, actually, he didn't say explicitly. It was derived from a story. Now, the Gemara likes to tell you this because it's not like someone said it explicitly. It was derived from a case that happened. And sometimes when we derive it, sometimes the Gemara will say, and they were wrong when they derived it from the story. And that's what they're going to say in our case. Sometimes they just point out that it was learned out from a situation, which, sometimes could go either way. Maybe it strengthens it. Sometimes it's, but maybe it could have been interpreted differently. But just know the person didn't say it directly. So now we're going to explain the story and we'll see how what they derived and why they derived it incorrectly. Dahu Tochsman, there was a person who was, let's go with the 18 opinion, and he was 17 in a day or 17 and a half. Sold the possessions of his father. And he came back in front of Rava. Okay, the case came before Rava. Obviously, there was a deliberation, there was a debate between the recipients, right, the buyers, and the son. Some wanted to say, I didn't mean it, and the buyers wanted to say, yes, you did, and it's ours. And he said, yeah, this was nothing. Now, why did they assume it was nothing? Because he was under 18. Those who saw thought they thought it was because he was not yet 18, hadn't hit his 18th birthday. Velohi, but that wasn't the reason. It was because, and now we're going to add a whole new element, which is that even though we give these years and cutoffs, and we have both years, we have physical maturity, but there's something else that plays into effect, which is it could be 17 in a day is a valid age, but not if you show that you really have no understanding of money, right? We know there's 17-year-olds who understand money, and there's some who don't understand money. There's 20-year-olds, right? There's all different ages of people who don't necessarily understand things properly. And he says, Hatam shtuti yeterata chazabe. Rabbi said, I saw this child really had no understanding of money. How do I know that? Well, he took the slaves that he inherited from his father and started just freeing them. Now, freeing slaves, you get nothing out of it, right? You just freed the slave. You don't get money for it. And that was a bad move, not a very smart financial move. So what do you see? Because of that, I disqualified this child's sale because I saw that the child had no understanding. Now we're going to see the flip of this sugya, which is perhaps you could be younger and show an understanding of money, and we will accept your sale. And this is the reverse. So he asked him a question. Yilamdena Rabbeinu, please teach us. Tinoket, like, tell me what to do in this case. Tinoket bar arba'as shana v'yom. We have a girl. Okay, tinoket in Hebrew means baby, but in the Gemara it always means child. It doesn't mean baby. A child that's 14 years old. Obviously, she wasn't a baby. And not only that, we're going to say she really knew what she was doing. She was 14 in a day. Yodat betiv masao matan, and she really understands business. She's very bright. Mahu. Interesting. It's a woman, a girl. Shalach le. So Rava said, "Im yodat betiv masam matet yeah, her sales are valid. She can sell her father's possessions that she inherited from him, and it will be a valid sale, and she won't be able to change her mind about it." Now the Gemara asks 2 questions on the story. Right? Usually the stories are about men. Why isn't it about a male child, and why is it about a female child? To which they answer, that just happened to be the situation that was in front of him. It could have been about a male as well. It's not that it's only a female who's 14 could be smart and and understand money, but not a male. Why 14 in a day? Theoretically, it could have been 12 in a day. Anything over bat mitzvah should have been valid. To which as long as she has the understanding. To which they answered, "You're right. Again, that was the case. It happened to be a girl. She happened to be 14. But you could take this to a boy. You could take this to anyone over bar bat mitzvah age. If they show that they really understand money, their sale is a sale," which is fascinating. We started with a katan can't sell nichse aviv, and then all of a sudden we start getting into, well, it depends on what they were. By the way, raises questions about the story that they were looking for simanim to show he was a minor. But what about, did he understand mekach umemkar? Maybe then it also would have been valid. Obviously, they have no way of checking that now, but I guess they could have asked witnesses about this person. Anyway, they don't go back to the other cases, though. Okay, now we're skipping again the words Hadar Avalav Beferish Itmar Lemichlala Itmar. Now we're going to the word Hahu. Now we have a great story. Hahu Pachomi Ben Esrim. There was a child under 20. He sold his property like Gidel Bar Menashe because he was a smart kid, understood Mekach Umemkar. He sold it, and theoretically it should be valid. But what happened? The child wanted to change his mind. He wanted to claim, "Oh, what do I know? I don't know anything about business." So, Atalakameh to Rava. He comes before Rava. Amrule Krovi. Now, before he went to Rava, his relatives advised him what to do. You want to get your money back? Show that you're an idiot. How so? We'll give you some advice, right? Remember, he doesn't have a father, so his relatives are advising him. Maybe it shows he wasn't so smart. He needed advice from his relatives, and you'll see who he takes advice from later on in the story as well. And you can make your decision at the end of the story, whether you think he really was intelligent or not. Anyway, what happened? They said to him, "Zil echol tamre, go eat some dates. V'shade be'kashiata be'Rava, and go throw the pits into the house of Rava." And what do kids do, right? Kids on the street, they throw the garbage into people's yards, no care for anybody's property, right? It's also a good example of, I don't care about property. I don't value other people's property. Could help with, I don't understand anything about a sale. Avid hachi, he did that. Anyway, it's a sure sign of immaturity to be throwing pits into Rava's house. Amar lahu, zvine lav zvine. And Rava rules, this is not a good sale. Look at this kid. He's a kid. Doesn't know anything. Okay, now, the buyers were very upset. They realized that they had been duped. So they come up with their own plan. Kika katvule shtara. Now, he has to go write a shtar now. What's the shtar? The shtar is going to say what Rava said in the court. Right? They would often write things down in a document. It had to document now. This is like when you have to pay the lawyer's fees. You get your money back, but you have to pay your lawyer's fees. So he gets his money back, but he has to pay for the document to be written to say, this money is now reverting back because this child is a minor. So he didn't, now when he went to pay the money, so he had to pay a zuz for the document. Now, obviously the kid probably didn't really want to pay money if he didn't have to. So Amrele Lekuchot, so the purchasers who wanted to get their land back, wanted the sale to be a valid sale, said, Zil Amalele Rava, go say the following to Rava. It's a great line. Megillat Esther Bezuza, Shtara Demar Bezuza. It costs a zuz to write a whole Megillat Esther. We always use in our, the whole Megillah, right? A Megillah is considered like a really long thing. It's a zuz to buy a Megillah, to get a sofer to write a Megillah. Halavai nowadays, it would cost that little. And it costs for my little simple shtar that says this money goes back to me, a zuz. So they said, go tell that to Rava. Like, why? And negotiate that you want him to give you a better price on the sofer, because why should you pay so much money if Megillat Esther only costs a zuz also? So Adal Amrle, so he goes to Rava and says this. Now, obviously, what does Rava say? Oh, what a smart kid. He's negotiating. He understands the value of money. Amar lehu, zvine zvine. So Rava reneges on his last ruling. I obviously made a mistake. This person's sale is a valid sale, and you lost your money. Amrle Krovim. The Krovim come to court and they say to Rava, Lekuchorag Maruhu. That wasn't him. That was, right? They were duping him into doing this. Obviously, they didn't admit about their own actions, but, they tried to vouch for him. Amar lehu, Rava says, sorry, but mizbare le savar, if somebody explains to you something, kevan de mizbare le v'savar made yada. If someone explains to you something and you go ahead with it, it means that now you understand. So that showed this is a kid who understands because he was taught to do something. He did it. He internalized it. Shows the kid's smart and knows what he's doing. David Hachi, and the fact you want to claim, well, what about the fact that he was throwing date pits into my house? That was just chutzpah yateru hudavabe. You could have a lot of people who are chutzpahdik, who are over 20, who are very smart, and just do things that are obnoxious, right? That was just chutzpahdik, but obviously this kid knew what he was doing. So I agree with you, what you're saying, Harriet, that this is all very subjective. And that's really what the sugya is getting at, that we have these clear ages, but it's not really so clear cut. And it really depends on the situation. On the other hand, it shows that you could be tricked, right? They tricked Rava in this situation and it wasn't. So, it's a little bit dangerous. But I think it's also interesting, if you think of the Megillat Esther, and I go back to what I said before, do you think the kid was really smart or just was taking advice? The fact that the kid was taking advice from everybody, from all the sides, maybe shows he wasn't so smart. In fact, he got himself messed up in the end. Maybe it shows he wasn't too bright. It reminded me, if you think about this, and the reference to Megillat Esther made me think of Achashverosh. He was very flippant. He kept listening to this one and then listening to that one and doing the opposite and sort of just what everyone, like a puppet, right? What everyone would tell him to do, that's what he would do. And that sounds like this kid as well. So I wonder in the end if he really was, but it was also Rava's way of punishing the family for, he probably figured out that the family was messing around with him. Okay, now moving on. It's just a cute story. Now we're going to finish up our daf pretty quickly. Amar Rav Huna B'rei Rav Yoshua Ule Edut Eduto Edut. Edut we accept from age 12 or 13. Okay, right? Boy, girl, or girl, boy. But even though they can't sell their property, they can testify. But Amar Marzutra Lo Amar Anel Metatale Aval Makarke Elo. No. Since they can't sell land and they don't understand the value of land, they actually can't testify about land as well. Most people say this means really about evaluations of land, and from there they extended it to anything about land, because theoretically, if they watched a sale, they should be able to testify. But he's really saying, right, we use the term lo plug, like once they took them out of land, like in terms of assessment of land, they don't really understand money yet, well, then we're going to take them out of all land testimony. So that's what Marzutra says. Amalei Rav Ashi le Marzutra. Rav Ashi says to Marzutra, Maishnami metaltale dzvine zvine. Elameata. So he says, but I don't understand. You're saying there's a direct connection between ability to testify, ability to sell means then you can testify about it. If you can't sell, you can't testify. But if you can sell, you can't testify. Well, we could take that to a different place and have kids testify very young, because there's a Mishna in Gitin, Elameata haditnan hapiutot mikra mekach umimkara meker b'metaltalin. Children, little children, they say in the Gemara, they're age 6 or 7 already understand the concept of buying and selling. I always think of kids who flip baseball cards, and in my day, that's what we used to do. Now it's all sorts of other cards. I don't know what they do anymore. But my kids, it was Pokemon cards. They understand there's value to these things at a certain age. And once they understand value of selling, then there's being, right? I think of those because, sometimes kids lose them and flip them, and, maybe they trade them and they don't really understand the value, and at a certain age, they start to understand the value. So young children who do understand the value can sell movables. So are you going to say, Hachanami de edutan edut? So then you can accept their testimony because you're connecting the two. You can't sell, so you can't testify, which means you can't sell, you can't testify. So they say, no, that's not a good question on me because I'm Arlay. He answers the question, Hatam be'inavam dushne anashim beleka. There there's a pasuk that talks about when we talk about a false witness, it says, and the two people stood before the court, 2 men. Men means grown men, and that's why children can't. In other words, yes, it's true. If you can't sell, you can't, again, this is just Marzutra's opinion, but he thinks you can't sell, you can't testify, but just because you can sell doesn't mean you can testify also. You have to also be a minimum age to fulfill the pasuk in the Torah. that we'll just start with Amemar, but we'll stop right here, which is Amemar says matana to matana. If they give a gift, the gift is a gift. Okay, they can't sell property under age 20 or whatever, under understanding, but they can give a gift, to which Rav Ashi says to Amemar, Amalei Rav Ashi Amemar. This is totally not logical, and we're going to have to deal with this tomorrow. Hashtu mazvine de makabel zuze amartelo dilma mozil umzabin koshke matana dilamata levelomidi. If you're going to say you can't sell something because we're worried that someone might take advantage and give him too little money, what about a matana where he gets nothing? All the more so, shouldn't we be worried he doesn't understand the value of money and just giving it away? So we'll get back to that. Tomorrow we'll have to figure out why Amemar thinks that this is the case, and then we'll see a bunch of Piskei Halacha about all these topics we've been discussing. So we started with the flip, and we had to ask, we reviewed yesterday, end of yesterday's daf, and then said, do we have to also flip the difficulty? That Rabbi Yochanan asked on Reish Lakish if we're flipping all the opinions, and we explained no, we didn't have to. Then we got to the whole question, which really took us throughout the daf, from there on about what is the age. Is it 18 or is it 20? We then learned that there's all sorts of exceptions to the rule. 20 or even 18, right? 18 or maybe even 20 is not enough unless you also have signs of maturity, unless you get proven to be a saris, you have signs of a saris, in which case 20, you would already be able to sell. Otherwise, we have to wait till 35 and a day. And then what about into the 17th year, into the 19th year, into the 18th year, into the 20th year, right? 17 a day, 19 in a day. We saw two opinions, although then we said one was really wrong. And it really is, right? Toch hazman kilifnei hazman. It is into the year and not, you don't need to get to your birthday. We had then all these exceptions of both girls and boys who were younger, right? Or at least we had a case of a girl, which we then learned to a boy who was younger, but showed maturity and understanding. Then the sale is a sale, which then we had that story that highlighted the difficulty of that, the challenges. And then we talked about the Ejud issue, and then we talked about their matana. Matana is valid according to Meimar, which we're going to have to understand why. That we finished for today. Wishing everyone a good day.